It was 6 words that detonated a life. Mum, I don't need you at my birthday. I had flown 6 hours with Richard's watch wrapped in tissue in my bag. The watch that had kept our household steady through small crises and celebrations. And I imagined a quiet reunion, a cake, a hug, grandchildren pressing into my lap. Instead, Anthony opened the door, his smile vanishing when he saw me. Abigail poised behind him, and those 6 words fell like a verdict. I stood on the porch, the sounds of laughter and music muffled by glass, and felt the years of labor compress into a single pulse. For decades my life had been the slow arithmetic of keeping promises. Negotiating at docks, smoothing paperwork, paying a vendor at midnight so a shipment would not fail. I left before spectacle could unfold. I had learned that humiliation sometimes requires a cool response. On the flight home I did not rage, I cataloged. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to give you a shout out in our next video. My story begins in a small storefront above a laundromat in Columbus, where I started Aileron Logistics with a rotary phone and stubborn faith. Early on, every invoice mattered. A misprinted bill of lading could mean a family in a coastal town lost an entire season's income. I learned to read customs forms the way others read newspapers, and I learned to speak in the precise language of documents and deadlines. The first container I convinced a boutique to take contained carved wooden figures and hand-woven baskets. I sat up nights ensuring the manifest matched the cargo. Richard was the quiet architecture of those years. He fixed the boiler at the office, balanced payroll when the accountant was late, and brought tea after long negotiations. He believed in the craft of steady work and in promises kept. When illness came, first a stroke, then cancer, the ledger of our life shifted. Hospital corridors replaced meeting tables. I learned medication schedules and insurance codes, and became the person who could translate a prognosis into an actionable plan. He left enough that we did not face immediate want, but money did not buy back evenings or conversations. I could have remarried. People proposed it as a practical route. Some thought a partner would steady the company. I refused. The pledge I had made to myself, to tend the children and steward the business, still felt unexpired. I poured resolve into work and parenting and did not seek another marital fix. I taught my daughters to respect agreements and my son to be resourceful. I kept the payroll rhythm, and made sure artisans on distant shores got paid. The work became my vow. Raising 3 children while running a firm is a daily practice of patient choices. I paid school fees quietly, smoothed tax snafus at odd hours, and negotiated with customs officers until a container moved. I never presented those acts as trophies. They were a life's ledger. So when Anthony shut the door on that Las Vegas porch, those invisible entries felt erased. For a moment I was not simply the mother in a photo. I was an inconvenient footnote. The watch in my bag was more than metal. It held memory. Richard bent over a ledger, ink on his fingers, a joke as he corrected a misentry. The small rituals that keep a household threaded. In that airport seat I counted contacts. Boutique owners who had trusted my first container, suppliers who had weathered late payments because I intervened, artisans who had sent me photos when seasons were saved. I resolved then to do something careful. To assemble the facts, call the people who witnessed the work, and reclaim a story with evidence rather than perform grief in public. Humiliation would not be the last word. I would answer with a ledger of truth. The day Richard's collapsed felt like a ledger page folding in half. One moment we were balancing invoices, and the next the air was filled with the metallic cry of an ambulance. He had complained of stiffness and fatigue, and we had both dismissed it at first. Hospitals teach you quickly that small errors in assessment become long courses of care. The stroke took his speech and some of his movement. Later a cancer diagnosis arrived and rearranged ordinary plans. We traded morning coffee for hospital corridors. I learned to read medical notes like shipping manifests, diagnosis codes instead of bill of lading numbers, medication schedules instead of delivery timetables. Richards, who used to fix the office heater, needed help lifting a cup. He kept his humor when he could and complained when he could not, and I became fluent in the new taxonomy, appointments, discharge planners, the quiet arithmetic of pills and follow-up visits. When he died the household felt hollowed. He left enough to avoid immediate want, but inheritance is not a remedy for grief. Money paid bills. It did not return the quiet rituals nor the late-night conversations. Friends suggested remarriage as a practical solution, a partner to share errands and payroll, but I chose continuity. My pledge to tend the children and steward the company felt unexpired, so I doubled down on work. I poured myself into the firm and into parenting. Grief and work braided into a daily practice. Supplier calls in the morning, school forms in the afternoon, negotiations in between, and bedtime stories at night. I hired a trusted operations manager, reinforced routes with reliable carriers, and deepened relationships with boutique owners who relied on punctuality. The company became a vessel for purpose. A container cleared customs on time felt like a small festival of relief in an otherwise raw season. Raising 3 children while running a business demands compartmentalization. Pain existed, but so did tasks that had to be done. Friends brought casseroles. Neighbors took a child for an afternoon, so I could finish a manifest. Those small acts were credits in an informal ledger that mattered. I learned to accept help because duty demanded steadiness more than spectacle. There were costs. Nights grew quieter, mornings sometimes hollow. Some admired my independence and called me resilient. Others presumed remarriage would ease burdens. The choice to remain single was practical and moral. A decision to preserve a promise rather than fragment obligations. It required a reserve of self-care I did not always honor. Business continued because relationships built over years did not evaporate with grief. Suppliers respected punctuality. Boutique owners valued honesty. The company expanded carefully. The work steadied the day and kept artisans paid. It also shaped the person Anthony became. He watched me translate grief into action and learned to value order. That lesson would later be read differently than I intended, and it would set the conditions for the reckonings to come. Grief retooled ambition into a different, harder kind of resolve. Children teach you the languages of a life. My 3 taught me 3 separate dialects. Evelyn loved maps and patterns. She became meticulous about schedules, and later built a steady life in Scotland where mornings were for school lunches and evenings for careful planning. Mitchell developed a stubborn aesthetic sense, and found a studio practice in Australia that required long nights and disciplined edits. Anthony grew into systems and engines. He preferred tidy solutions and clear outcomes, translating effort into measurable progress. Evelyn's steadiness became a refuge in hard years. She married and settled in Perth, sent photographs of beaches and 2 bright boys, and offered practical counsel across time zones. Her calls were exact: inventory timing, school calendars, reminders that prevented small crises. Mitchell sent studio updates and fierce messages about priorities. She became a family counsel who insisted on precision. Their lives were far from home, but their loyalty was active and administratively precise. Anthony remained geographically closer for longer, and for a while that nearness felt like a blessing. He worked with his hands and watched engines with tenacity. He helped with crates, made spontaneous repairs, and could be counted on when a problem required physical work. When an opportunity in oil and gas appeared, he took it, and I felt the private pride of a mother who watched a child find a field that suited him. The job promised higher pay and a different world, but distance brings new pressures. A decisive influence arrived when Anthony met Adams Nicholas. Adams had once seen me in a customs office negotiate a release that saved an artisan's season. He admired practical competence. He took Anthony under his wing, offering introductions, coaching, and a path into executive rooms. Adams taught my son to translate technical skill into strategic rhetoric, to craft a narrative that invites investor trust, and to present choices as confident, composed plans. Adams's mentorship brought promotions and equity. It accelerated Anthony's ascent, but introduced a new grammar of success. Discretion over disclosure and polish over messy context. Where I had prized transparency and the small human invoices that stitch communities together, Adams emphasized seamless narratives and composure. Anthony learned both sets of rules, and the duality served him, until the costs of curated image collided with the ledger of care. Change was incremental. Family photos narrowed. Anecdotes of early struggle were smoothed. Abigail, his wife, fit naturally into a world that valued surface and presentation, and she often regarded my bluntness as awkward. These social omissions accumulated into a quieter estrangement. Anthony remained generous in practical ways, transferring funds when a supplier needed urgent help, but presence and warmth were inconsistent. I recorded both sorts of care, because a life's ledger includes monetary entries and the unpaid account of presence. Adams's role complicated obligations. He respected my work and had given a protege a path. Later he would also be charged with balancing mentorship and corporate duty. His memory of nights when I rescued shipments meant he could see the human cost beneath a polished resume. When an institutional reckoning became necessary, that memory mattered. Evelyn and Mitchell watched from afar and acted with administrative tenderness. They cataloged receipts, called suppliers, and prepared to insist that dignity be restored through measurable acts. Family is constellated with different choices. I had taught honesty and reliability. My children translated those teachings into distinct lives. Evelyn's steadiness, Mitchell's creative stubbornness, and Anthony's appetite for polish were not moral absolutes, but differences that would later require a careful accounting. I kept building bridges and saving documentation, certain that facts would matter when reckoning came. That belief would guide my next steps in reclaiming respect and repair. It began as a small annoyance after a long trip. One morning my left eye refused to close completely. I blamed travel at first. Then my smile looked uneven, one side of my mouth lagged when I spoke, and tiny drips of tears collected without warning. Small things piled until they demanded attention. The face is more than appearance. It is an instrument of expression. Losing partial control of it feels like losing a language. A doctor confirmed facial palsy, an inflammation of the facial nerve that can follow viral infections, nerve compression, or occur without clear cause. Steroids could reduce inflammation. Physiotherapy could retrain muscles. Recovery timelines vary. The tests were clinical. The consequences were intimate. My face had been my currency in negotiations and in kindness, and losing some control of it altered how I moved through the world. Symptoms were practical and stubborn. My speech had a faint slur on certain consonants. One ear felt strangely sensitive. Tears escaped from an unprotected eye, and I taped my eyelid at night to prevent corneal damage. Drinking from a cup required attention. Smiling for photographs turned into an exercise. I learned daily exercises, tiny contractions, facial massages, deliberate repetitions, to rebuild muscle memory. Physiotherapy taught visualization and patience. The social effect was immediate. People noticed my eye before they knew my story. They hesitated in conversation or treated me as a curiosity. Meetings felt different. Attention sometimes drifted to the asymmetry rather than my argument. The slights were small at first but cumulative. The hard part was maintaining dignity as strangers' eyes searched for an explanation. My children supported recovery in different ways. Evelyn coordinated telemedicine sessions. Mitchell organized short-term caregiving and kept therapy notes. Anthony sent funds and offered practical advice, but his visits were brief. Their gestures reflected temperaments and proximity. None of their approaches were without love. The pattern of care mirrored larger family differences. Some were administratively exact, others emotionally steady, and one more oriented toward image-driven solutions. Recovery was negotiation, biology and stubbornness. I practiced exercises like a seamstress aligning thread. Tears still leaked occasionally, my speech retained a cadence. I developed small habits, tilting my head in photographs, hiding the weakness when I could. I delegated more in business, relied on a trusted operations manager for public presentations, and let colleagues advocate where nerves tired. Those allies mattered. Emotionally, the palsy reorganized how I saw myself. The face had been a tool for connection. When it faltered, I felt exposed, but I also discovered kindness from unexpected places. A supplier's handwritten note, a neighbor dropping off soup. Those gestures were credits to a depleted account. I regained much movement, though not all. The experience deepened my empathy and changed how I presented myself. I learned to let facts, not faces, guide me. That lesson would shape how others later judged me and how I decided to respond when image became a weapon. The sentence hit me like a closing of a ledger. "Mum, I don't need you at my birthday party. You don't look presentable enough for my friends and business partners. I had flown across states with Richard's watch in my bag, the small instrument that had once marked our household's quiet victories. I had imagined a modest arrival, a brief embrace, and candles that smelled of vanilla. Instead, Anthony opened his door, left a gap of air between us, and the world I knew contracted. I did not react theatrically. Public humiliation becomes gossip. I had no appetite for spectacle. I thanked him for the invitation he had effectively withdrawn, and left before the tableau could widen. On the flight home I wrote a ledger. Dates of payments, transfers, nights beside hospital beds. Evidence, not spectacle, would be my equalizer. I called Adams Nicholas because he had institutional clout and memory. He had seen me negotiate at a dock and respected competence. When I explained the porch encounter and presented a compact record of favors and interventions, Adams spoke of governance, audits, temporary leave, and the necessity of a formal process. He placed Anthony on a 3-month compulsory leave while auditors examined contracts Anthony had handled. The move sounded administrative, but functioned as serious accountability. Anthony and Abigail reacted with denial, and then frantic mitigation. They called friends, tried to shape narratives, and leaned on charm. Audits, however, follow documents, dates, invoices, delivery confirmations. Charm does not correct a record. When they came to my Columbus address expecting raw access, they found the house sold. I had moved to keep reconciliation from being staged. The sale was a boundary that shocked them into urgency. For 5 days they pursued me with emails, voicemails, and intermediaries. My daughters insisted any meeting be structured and documented. They organized invoices, verified shipments, and prepared legal terms for remediation. When Anthony and Abigail finally came, exhausted and contrite at times, they pledged cooperation. Abigail apologized. Anthony acknowledged that image had eclipsed gratitude. They signed commitments to contact vendors and to accept oversight. We convened with Adams and Company Counsel to make the terms binding. Documented apologies, verified payments to affected vendors, a probationary oversight period for Anthony, and public acknowledgement where required. The goal was repair, not spectacle. Humiliation transformed into an accountable program of work and restitution. Months later, audits concluded, remediation flowed to affected suppliers, and policies tightened. Anthony bought a nearby home and invited me to move closer. I accepted only with firm boundaries. I would be present on my terms, not polished into someone else's image. Abigail learned, imperfectly, to value action over facade, and my daughters remained watchful. The ordeal taught me a simple, precise lesson. Dignity is reclaimed by patient documentation and demanding measurable repair. I had been humiliated on a porch, but humiliation need not be the final story. By assembling facts, invoking institutional processes, and insisting on binding restitution, I reclaimed my place through calm resolve rather than spectacle. There is a quiet geography to shame. It creeps along the edges of ordinary days, until one morning you find it has redrawn the map of your life. I first noticed its architecture in Anthony's posture. How he would stand slightly farther from me in photographs. How his smile shortened when a conversation turned toward family. At first I called it change, the inevitable drift as children grow and form new households. But it was something colder. It had a direction and a purpose. To remove me from the frame of his life that he presented to others. When he began correcting my speech and attire, I told myself it was the price of his success. I had taught him to be meticulous. I had always prized clarity and presentation. Yet there was a cruelty in his meticulousness that I had not anticipated. He edited me as if I were copy to be proofread, not a person who had taught him to tie his shoes and to save for school. A mother who had spent nights balancing invoices and wiping feverish brows became, in his world, a problem to be managed or concealed. The small daily cuts were the worst. At a family lunch, Abigail moved my chair slightly out of frame before taking photos for social media. At a cousin's wedding, he steered conversations away from my stories. In meetings, he would apologize for my raucous laugh as if I had transgressed a decency he wished to buy with his time. Each incident was small enough to be explained away, yet together they compiled into a dossier of neglect. I tried to speak to him about it in soft, private ways, remembering the tenderness of his childhood. I invited him for tea and spoke of Richard's, of the early days when we built routes from a single phone and a van. He would listen and then turn the call to work, to deadlines or to an upcoming investor. His empathy seemed to shrink to the size of a conference room. Once in frustration, I asked him plainly whether I had done something to cause this distance. He looked at me and said, without malice but with bluntness, that he was constructing a life that required a different image. It was easier, he said, if certain elements of his past were not on display. That answer hurt because it made my love transactional, something he thought of as a liability. I began to keep careful records, not as a ledger of entitlement, but as a reminder to myself of what had been given. I wrote down nights I had missed to pay tuition, the times I had quietly stepped into a bank office at dawn to cover a tax shortfall, the shipment delays I had personally smoothed over so he could finish his degree. I kept the receipts in a folder and the memories in a notebook, not because I expected payment, but because the truth must sometimes be assembled with evidence. Watching my grandchildren greet me with polite reserve hurt more than any public slight. Children are honest mirrors. Their hesitance reflected the change in my son. He had traded the messy, human parts of lineage for a clean public aesthetic. It is a bitter thing to see your work, your long hours, your moral instruction, marginalized by a cultivated persona that values appearances over depth of care. Nevertheless, I did not collapse into bitterness. I sought to understand whether there were faults I had overlooked as a parent. Had my bluntness alienated him? Had I been too controlling at times, so that now his need for autonomy manifested as distancing? These questions stung, but they were necessary. I believe a parent must always be willing to inspect their failings as critically as their virtues. Yet my self-examination did not absolve the pain of being abandoned to appearances. There came a moment when the cumulative effect of his shame moved from private neglect to public humiliation. It altered how I saw myself and how I believed the world saw me. The moment was a fulcrum. Until then, the removals had felt like small intellectual slights. After, they felt like an eviction. I realized then that my response could not be the same as before. Where once I might have pleaded, I now had to prepare. I would gather evidence, call upon relationships I had forged over decades, and ask the men and women who had known my work to testify to a truth that could not be polished away by a single sentence. That insistence became a quiet program of action. I spoke to suppliers who had always appreciated my straightforwardness, and who had benefited from the shipping routes I built. I checked old contracts to remind myself of dates and settlements. I wrote down the timeline of slights in a journal, not to nurse them into obsession, but to ensure I could speak factually if I needed to. Shame had attempted to unmake me quietly. My work now was to reassemble myself more deliberately, with evidence and dignity, and to make sure the ledger reflected the life I had spent building. I resolved to call Adams Nicholas, to explain not with fury but with facts, and to ask for an accounting that would force Anthony to reckon with what his words had cost. It was not revenge, it was restoration. Adams Nicholas was a man who kept a ledger of reputations. I met him years before Anthony ever entered his orbit. An executive with steady hands and a sharp eye who happened to step into a shipping yard the day a misrouted container risked wiping out a small artisan collective. I was there, arguing with customs, bartering for time, and he watched me tally commitments and calm vendors in a way that, apparently, impressed him. He liked people who solved problems quietly, those who preferred fact to flourish. When Adams took an interest in Anthony, it felt at first like a vindication of everything I had taught my children. I had spoken of my son with honest pride, of his mechanical curiosity, his relentlessness in projects, and his hunger to build something meaningful. Adams offered a mentorship that combined coaching, introductions, and an unspoken pathway through the corridors of corporate possibility. He taught Anthony how to translate a technical aptitude into boardroom language, how to make a slide deck that landed, how to move from engineering instinct to executive decisions. I observed the transformation with mixed feelings. There was pride. No mother can avoid that, but also wariness. Adams's favor came with a model of success that prized polish, discretion, and the appearance of infallibility. Where I had prized transparency and the messy algebra of human lives, Adams taught discretion. Close the gap, smooth the edges, and never expose the underbelly in public. It was effective. Anthony accelerated through ranks and found himself authorized to sign off on contracts and to influence bids that mattered. But patronage is a double-edged blade. The more a protege ascends on another's backing, the more vulnerable they are to the patron's politics. Adams protected Anthony from casual rebukes and small errors, but he could not stop the company's auditors from noticing inconsistencies in a terminal contract. The discrepancy was a departure from procedure, something a sharp-eyed auditor would flag. Dates that didn't match shipment logs, vendor invoices with odd line items, payments routed in ways that raised questions. Anomalies have a way of inviting scrutiny. Adams reacted the way a man who has both personal loyalty and corporate duty must, with a fierce, unsettled recalibration. He remembered how I had, years ago, brokered a solution that saved vendors and preserved goodwill. He knew the human cost of sloppy accounting. Yet he also recognized that ignorance would not suffice as defense in a world of analysts and fiduciary duty. He placed Anthony under careful observation, counseled him on corrections, and attempted to shield him while auditors completed their review. When I told Adams about the humiliation at Anthony's door, he listened with a gravity that surprised me. He had always been principled, but the thing that moved him was recognition of what family sacrifices had helped build, and recognition that a man who could publicly scorn his own mother might have a brittle moral compass. Adams was not vengeful. He was disappointed, and disappointment from him could cut deeper than a reprimand. That disappointment translated into action. He convened authoritatively, nudged compliance processes into motion, and began a review framed in corporate necessity. It was an elegant move. Adams knew an outright firing would create scandal. Ignoring the matter would signal weakness. A compulsory leave for investigation served multiple ends. It signaled the company's commitment to probity. It forced Anthony to confront the consequences of his behavior, and it allowed Adams to assert that mentorship included moral education. For me, it was a strange vindication. My son would be held accountable not only by me but by the structures that had enabled his rise. There were deeper layers I could see then. Adams's loyalty to me as someone who had once saved a shipment resonated with a larger ethic. He believed in reciprocal responsibility, not a blind shielding, but an expectation that help would be returned with integrity. He used his position not as pure power but as a corrective instrument. In doing so, he exposed how tightly entangled personal relationships and corporate governance could be. His decision to act, to hold his protege to account while arranging a path back should he show genuine contrition, set the terms for our reconciliation. That choice would ultimately force an accounting that neither family pride nor corporate convenience could fully escape. The act of carrying Richard's watch felt like carrying a whole life in my palm. The weight of promises, the faint gouge where a chain had once snagged, the polished face that once told time in a kitchen where bills were tallied and plans were made. I wrapped it in tissue and placed it in my bag, then boarded the flight to Las Vegas with an odd buoyancy. This trip was not about spectacle. It was a pilgrimage. I wanted to stand beside my son and offer him something that belonged to memory rather than to marketing. I arrived in heat and light. Las Vegas smelled of infrastructure, air-conditioned lobbies, whirring compressors, and the faint sweetness of catering beyond closed doors. When I reached his house, the driveway was lined with cars and the sound of laughter escaped through floor-to-ceiling windows. The scene inside seemed curated for photographs. The air tasted of hors d'oeuvres and carefully managed applause. I steadied myself and rang the bell for a moment that felt both intimate and impossible. Anthony opened the door with an amiable politeness that shifted the instant he recognized me. His expression tightened as though a script had been interrupted. He stepped out, closed the door as if to keep me at a safe distance from the pageantry inside, and said with a composed brusqueness, "Mum, I don't need you at my birthday party. You don't look presentable enough for my friends and business partners." Those words fell like a verdict. Abigail's look of approval sharpened the blow. I sensed that to her I represented narrative friction, not kin. I stood on the porch with the watch in my hand, feeling the world through the thin skin between indignity and resolve. I could have argued. I could have demanded respect. But I have always chosen calculation over theatrics. I thanked him for the invitation he had effectively refused and left before more people could be drawn into a private wound. The way I walked back to the car was deliberate. People might remember the event in gossamer stories. I would remember the ledger of years that had led to that moment. On the flight home, I unfolded my memories the way one unfolds a route map. I thought of the nights I had sat up with him, the times I had mediated tuition payments, the way Richards and I had cobbled together household bills. I counted favors done quietly for friends who would never know the full shape of my work. The humiliation had been public. My response would be private, methodical, and precise. That evening I made a list of those who might speak truth if called upon. Suppliers in Accra who had weathered missed payments because I intervened, boutique owners in Ohio who had trusted my judgment, and colleagues who had watched the years of labor I poured into our routes. I tucked the list into the small notebook I carried and called Adams. I did not call in rage, but in enumeration. I explained calmly the scene at his protégé's doorstep, and then presented the evidence of debts and favors I had kept tucked away. Adams responded as if he had been expecting a test. He said little and then suggested we meet. He did not leap into retribution but into strategy. For a man of his stature, the language of consequence is often bureaucratic. Audits, compliance reviews, and the invocation of governance structures. I appreciated the professionalism. He promised to convene a review that would be framed in corporate necessity, not family drama. His intervention was, in effect, a translation. He would use corporate process as remedy for a social wound. In the days that followed, I reached out to old contacts with a steadiness that surprised even me. They replied with concise affirmations. Times I had cleared payments at midnight, how I had rescued shipments with a single call, and how I had advocated for small producers whose seasons depended on timely departures. Those messages formed a ledger of truth I could present calmly. My daughters were immediate. Evelyn demanded action and Mitchell insisted on strategy. They both urged prudence but supported me fully. The network I had built across ports and boutiques was not sentimental. It was practical, and its practicality would prove essential in the weeks ahead. I prepared evidence, not revenge, strictly so. When Adams called a formal review, the machinery of corporate consequence began to hum like an engine that had been idle too long. He framed the action as a necessary safeguard. A 3-month compelled leave pending an audit of the contracts Anthony had managed. For investors and the board, it was a defensible move. For Anthony, it was exile by paperwork. When the news reached him, he reacted first with disbelief, and then with panic. Anthony and Abigail attempted to minimize the damage with confidence that often masks panic. They dialed company contacts, texted friends, and summoned allies to smooth the narrative. Abigail tried charm over private messages, suggesting to mutual acquaintances that I had overreacted, and that the matter was a private family spat. Anthony called Adams directly, voice tight, offering explanations and promises to cooperate. He pleaded that the anomalies were clerical and could be corrected quickly. Adams listened without haste, mindful of fiduciary duty. Rumors began to ripple. An audit flag in one contract invited questions about others. Investors asked for clarity, partners sought reassurances, and colleagues watched a promising career oscillate between rescue and collapse. Anthony's colleagues were no longer casual allies. Some distanced themselves, wary of contagion. The company's culture turned cautious, and that caution felt like a public mirror reflecting private failures. In the first flurry of calls, Anthony and Abigail drove to my Columbus address, as if a direct appeal could undo what had started. They rang the bell and waited, faces taut with calculation. When a neighbor told them the house had been sold, the color drained from Anthony's face. He had not expected finality. He had expected an apology and a swift reconciliation. Instead, he found absence. Panic took a new shape. Bewilderment that the person he had dismissed could have chosen agency. They began to hunt. Calls multiplied, voicemails that alternated between contrition and negotiation. Abigail left messages that sounded rehearsed. Anthony's calls alternately broke with grief and with thinly veiled bargaining. They despaired, then pleaded with Adams, then tried to enlist friends to mediate. It was drama for the cameras that did not yet exist, an intimate soap played out in private messages. My daughters, when they learned of the humiliation, reacted with a clarity that registered as faithfulness. Evelyn's voice, usually calm, rose into an edge I recognized. Furious, protective, and painfully precise in what she wanted. Mitchell's response was action. Counsel, a plan, and immediate outreach to anyone who could corroborate the ledger I had compiled. They were not interested in spectacle. They wanted accountability and care for their mother. The 5 days stretched long and strange. Each sunrise delivered new pleas. Anthony's voice on voicemail, Abigail's urgent texts, and Adams's measured updates about board sentiment. My daughters called early and late. Evelyn urged that we demand accountability, and Mitchell arranged legal counsel to ensure the reconciliation would be formal and witnessed. Industry friends whispered that a tidy apology would not repair institutional trust. They advised that restoration must be demonstrable, audited, and sustained. Clients sought clarity and some paused engagements awaiting the audit's outcome. The auditors lengthened their inquiries, and the rumor of irregularities crept into investor correspondence. Adams proposed a mediated roundtable with legal observers, company officials, and my daughters present by video link. It would be formal enough to satisfy governance yet private enough to allow sincere contrition. I wanted repair, not spectacle, and I prepared my terms carefully. I learned that resolve can be a quiet craft, assembled out of days and receipts rather than a single roaring moment. After the flight home, I did not move immediately, but I planned with precision. I sold the house in Columbus not to punish, but to create distance and discretion. That sale allowed me to breathe, and to form a space where the conversation would happen on my terms. I wanted to be outside the emotional rawness of their pleas, and I wanted the record to be clear. My first calls were practical. I reached out to a handful of suppliers and boutique owners who had long been informal allies. Their confirmations of past favors and rescued payments became the backbone of an evidentiary file I could present calmly. I asked my daughters to stand by. They negotiated with a firmness I had come to admire. Evelyn coordinated logistics, Mitchell engaged legal counsel, and together we crafted terms that would allow reconciliation if, and only if, certain conditions were met. Adams, understanding the necessity of governance, insisted on a structured process. He required a formal, recorded apology, a full audit of the contracts Anthony had handled, and a hospitality of restitution where needed. He also insisted, perhaps more as moral pedagogy than corporate policy, that Anthony engage in meaningful outreach to suppliers affected by any discrepancies and a program to support artisan communities that had depended on timely payments. The day of the roundtable came with an icy smallness to it. A conference room, chairs arranged with legal pads and water glasses, and a recorded line that would later stand as evidence in a corporate file. Anthony sat opposite me looking smaller than the photos that once announced him in glossy company newsletters. Abigail's face was composed in the way practiced people maintain composure, calm but guarded. My daughters were on a screen, their faces steadied by distance and by protective anger. Anthony's apology was read like a statement rehearsed, and then ruptured by honesty. He spoke of shame, of impatience, and of a failure to see the human toll of his words. He admitted he had allowed an image to supersede his memory of what sacrifice required. There were parts that felt polished and parts where the voice broke. Honesty arrived in jagged pieces. He consented publicly to the audits and to the oversight, and agreed to a year of monitored restitution for partners who had been harmed. Adams judged the apology and the commitments credible enough to reinstate Anthony on conditions. The company would undertake an independent audit, and Anthony would be under supervision for a probationary period. The agreement included contractual terms for transparency and scheduled reports to the board. For a man who had benefited from patronage, the return now required public labor and humility, a contrast stark enough to be instructive. After the meeting, Anthony asked me to move closer. He bought a house in the same gated estate where he lived and insisted it was a gesture of reconciliation. To accept meant navigating a complicated tenderness. Proximity would let me hold my grandchildren often, but it also risked reopening wounds if the pretense of peace collapsed. I agreed to move with clear boundaries. I would be present on my terms. I would not be polished into someone else's image. Over the following months there were small, human reconciliations and stubborn traces of damage. Abigail attempted to be kinder, Sometimes clumsily, my daughters kept watch. Anthony tried to be consistent and faltered occasionally. The audits concluded with recommendations for improved controls. A small number of vendors were compensated where irregularities were found. The public narrative settled, but the private ledger remained. I kept a modest ritual. Sunday letters to suppliers, weekly calls to my daughters, and an evening walk where I reflected on what dignity required. I vowed to teach my grandchildren that reputation is earned by kindness and labor, not curated by image or the applause of strangers. Always. The loyalty of a man can be measured by the way he answers a woman who has kept his world afloat. I tested that metric when I picked up the phone and called Adams Nicholas. Adams answered on the second ring with an economy of greeting that suggested he was never far from business. I did not break into dramatic accusations or drown the line in grief. I spoke in the calm arithmetic of deeds. Shipments rerouted at midnight, tuition quietly paid. A supplier pushed past a cutoff because a child needed schoolbooks. I told him exactly what had happened on Anthony's porch, the words that had landed like a verdict, and the way Abigail's smile had made the scene into theater for anyone watching. I listed dates, small favors, and old invoices, evidence of a lifetime threaded into ledgers. He listened without interruption and then, with a patience I recognized from the years he had watched me bargain in ports, asked for details. When I finished, there was a long silence that felt like a weighing scale settling. Adams asked one practical question after another. He did not promise retribution, he promised process. He said the company would open an internal review, and that for the protection of vendors and investors a temporary leave would be placed on Anthony while auditors looked into flagged contracts. He framed it as governance, but the meaning was clear. Accountability would not be avoided. When the board approved the leave and auditors began combing procurement documents, the corporate world began to change its posture. Meetings that once included Anthony were quietly rescheduled. Clients asked for alternate contacts. Men who had once claimed him as a rising star now kept a polite distance, their calendars adjusting like the careful avoidance of a storm. The 3-month compulsory leave was a polite phrase for exile. For a man whose life had been a pattern of advancement, the pause felt like a fissure. Anthony reacted in the way I had come to expect from someone who believed appearance could rewrite history. First disbelief, then anger. He accused Adams of weaponizing corporate governance because of a family quarrel. That argument failed because Adams had a longer ledger than Anthony supposed. He remembered me stepping into a customs office at dawn, negotiating for artisans whose livelihoods depended on a container's release, saving contracts and reputations in ways that quietly protected everyone in that chain. Adams's memory of those moments made him less inclined to meekly excuse public cruelty. The audit, once underway, revealed anomalies in a terminal contract, dates that did not match shipping logs, invoices with odd-line items, payments routed in ways that begged for explanation. The anomalies were not verdicts but invitations. They compelled inquiry. Adams used the audit as leverage. He could not ignore the structural questions and pretend the personal humiliation meant nothing. He framed the investigation as the company protecting itself and its partners. At the same time, he made clear to Anthony that there would be personal consequences for a pattern of choices that allowed image to outrun care. Anthony and Abigail scrambled, calling friends and partners, attempting to shape a narrative that would make the pause appear temporary and forgivable. Abigail leaned on social contacts and reached out to mutual acquaintances to soften the optics. Anthony composed fallible apologies and promises, sending notes that read like rehearsed lines. But charm does not move auditors, it does not correct ledgers. The leave rippled further than either of them anticipated. Colleagues adjusted distances, and vendors asked for reassurances that payments would be prompt and documented. In those long hours I felt both vindication and a complex sorrow. I did not relish spectacle. I wanted accountability and repair. I instructed Evelyn and Mitchell to prepare the evidence I had accumulated: bank records, shipment logs, supplier attestations, and email threads. We would present facts, not dramatic accusations. Adams promised to frame the inquiry in governance language, while protecting procedural fairness. My aim was not to destroy my son but to ensure he faced consequences that taught humility and prompted restitution. I sat quietly that night and arranged my notes, patiently waiting for the slow, inevitable machinery to turn soon. Panic has a peculiar geometry. It expands to fill every available rationalization until you are left with a single, urgent shape. How to make the world forget you were caught. Anthony's first instinct was denial, then argument, then frantic mitigation. Abigail mobilized social capital, calling friends and influential alumni to soften reputational tremors. They tried to reframe the story as a family spat blown out of proportion, an attempt to translate consequence into private embarrassment rather than institutional inquiry. They drafted press-ready explanations, sweetened language with promises of cooperation, and asked allies to whisper for mercy. But audits do not care for whispers, they follow paper. When they drove to my Columbus address, they discovered it had been sold. The realtor's records were public. The house was gone. The realization that I had created distance shocked them. Anthony had assumed proximity would be negotiable. The sale was a refusal to be available on their terms. Panic calcified into strategy. Frantic calls to Adams, urgent meetings with lawyers, attempts to buy goodwill with favors and promises. Friends who once provided cover withdrew as the story hardened into a corporate matter. Inside the company corridors, the leave looked like a stain that colleagues tried to protect themselves from. Clients who had once sought Anthony's involvement shifted to alternatives. Meetings that had been his arena were reallocated. For a career built on momentum, the enforced hiatus felt like a slow professional amputation. The public consequences leaked into private collapse. Anthony fainted in the middle of a council session. Nights found him staring at old family photos and wondering how a childhood filled with my sacrifices had become something to be hidden. Legal counsel dissected the contracts and found procurement shortcuts, expediencies that had bypassed verification. Each anomaly demanded a response. Audits, vendor outreach, documented remediation. Counsel urged full cooperation. Adams, who had invested in Anthony's rise, balanced loyalty and duty. He refused immunity for a protege and required true contrition and corrective action. That stance turned private shame into institutional consequence. Anthony's pride became a desperate undertaking. He called on mentors and tried to stitch the narrative back together with promises. Abigail's social maneuvering frayed under the pressure of documented suspicions. The story stopped being simply about a harsh sentence at a doorstep and became an examination of how favor and image can allow procedural corners to be cut. The descent was not sudden. It was a sequence of small withdrawals, clients refusing calls, colleagues keeping distance, invitations quietly rescinded. Evelyn and Mitchell, when summoned, did not rush to soften blame. They mobilized legal counsel, messages to suppliers, and an insistence that any reconciliation be documented and enforceable. For them, family dignity required practical restitution, not performance. Anthony's isolation grew as his old supports recalculated risk. The leave became less an interval and more a hinge, and whether it would swing toward repair or collapse depended on the work he was willing to do beyond press releases. Begging reshapes a person. For Anthony and Abigail, it altered posture and tone in ways both revealing and necessary. They tried distance-first tactics, private messages, carefully worded emails, and attempts to enlist friends to plead on their behalf. But Adams insisted on a different remedy. Personal contrition to be delivered without corporate buffers. He required that they come to me and ask directly, not through intermediaries. They resisted the humiliation at first, arranging PR-managed apologies, but corporate process left them little choice. They flew, they drove, and they rehearsed. Neighbors noticed their arrival. The spectacle of a son pleading for reinstatement did not remain private. At the first approach I refused them. Their initial attempts felt staged, crafted for sympathy rather than confession. Abigail's messages sometimes read like social media scripts. Anthony's pleas, when not coached, revealed the raw edge of panic. My daughters demanded precision, recorded apologies, signed commitments to remediation, and proof of outreach to any vendor who had been harmed. The crisis produced a public sequence of pleas, and then a private collapse. Anthony fell to his knees one evening beneath a porch light in an image that felt both shattering and necessary. Abigail wept, admitting that she had judged and excluded too quickly. They spoke of fear, of losing a career and the social capital they had spent to construct a polished life. Their words sometimes rang true and sometimes sounded like bargaining. They promised restitution. They promised oversight. They promised transparency. Adams required more than tears. Legal counsel drafted enforceable terms, a recorded public apology, participation in supplier outreach, and a remediation schedule audited by an independent firm. Anthony signed the documents in counsel's presence. He agreed to have his work supervised for a probationary period, and to participate in direct reconciliation with affected suppliers. Evelyn and Mitchell monitored every clause and refused cosmetic gestures. They insisted that any apology be matched by measurable action. 5 days of repeated pleas culminated in a mediated conversation convened by Adams. The meeting was not spectacle, it was a negotiation with witnesses, company counsel, the audit team, my daughters on screen, and me in the room. Anthony read a prepared statement that broke in parts into true regret. He admitted that he had allowed image to outrun gratitude and promised to repair harm. I listened with the records I had kept. Emails, invoices, and supplier attestations that mapped my long work. The mediated outcome replaced public shame with contractual accountability. Anthony would be reinstated only after the audit provided a path to remediation, and supplier restitution began. For me, the change mattered. Humiliation had become a program of repair. The 5 days left them chastened and committed to work that would prove whether contrition could be lived rather than performed. The room smelled of coffee and legal pads. It smelled like the business of truth. Roundtable meetings are not sentimental reconciliations. They are choreography of terms, witnesses, and enforceable language. Adams convened the session with company counsel present, my daughters on a screen, and a recorded line that would become part of the formal file. He opened with an insistence on process. There would be a recorded apology, an independent audit, a remediation schedule for vendors, and a probationary period for Anthony's decisions. I demanded restitution that could be measured. Words alone would not suffice. I required supplier outreach, documented payments, and public reports to the board. Anthony read his apology with lowered eyes. Part of it was trained language, parts of it cracked into authenticity. He admitted prioritizing image and acknowledged the cruelty he had inflicted at my door. He promised to participate in remediation and to subject himself to oversight. The auditor set tight timelines. Initial vendor outreach within 2 weeks, settlement offers or payment schedules within 45 days where delays were verified, and board progress reports every 30 days. The audit would be conducted by an external firm experienced in procurement and shipping. If breaches were found, remediation would include restitution and negotiated contract fixes. Legal counsel turned moral commitments into binding clauses and appended them to Anthony's employment terms. My daughters insisted on precision. Evelyn removed ambiguity from language. Mitchell insisted on explicit deadlines. They shifted the meeting from a transactional apology to a structured covenant. Adams framed the process as restoration through governance. I felt that description was right. The agreement turned private humiliation into accountable repair, a transformation that required visible labor rather than mere sentiment. After the meeting, Anthony began direct supplier outreach, and auditors found procedural lapses, not wholesale fraud but negligence born of expediency. The remediation schedule kicked in. Settlements, documented payments, and a supplier protection fund proposed for future resilience. The company issued a statement describing the action as accountability rather than spectacle, and the public narrative bent toward corporate responsibility. The roundtable did not heal everything overnight. It did something harder. It converted the wound into work. I left the room with a ledger in hand, and a sense that dignity would now be defended by process, not only by emotion. The return key in my hand felt heavier than any cargo manifest I had ever signed. It was weight made not of metal but of consequence. After audits and the remediation steps began, Anthony returned under conditions: oversight, recorded apology, and a documented program of restitution to vendors. He presented a modest house key one afternoon, an invitation to proximity, and a symbol of an apology converted into presence. I accepted to move nearby only with terms that preserved my autonomy and dignity. No pretense, no crafted appearances. My daughters coordinated the logistics, delegating daily operations to trusted managers, while I retained strategic oversight. Anthony's restitution was practical. He joined recorded supplier calls, made direct apologies, and agreed to payment schedules for vendors affected by procurement lapses. The auditors required proof of payments and contributed to designing a supplier protection fund. The company committed a percentage of quarterly margins to ensure small producers had recourse when delays occurred. Letters from artisans, Amina from Accra and a boutique owner in New Jersey, arrived and confirmed that these steps mattered. Adams and the board acknowledged that public accountability must match private reparations. Evelyn and Mitchell remained watchful guardians. They insisted on quarterly compliance reports, direct vendor verification, and documentation of all remediation actions. Their oversight was steady rather than punitive. It was meant to prevent recurrence. Family governance acquired new clauses, no private bargains and transparent commitments. Life near Anthony altered daily rhythms. Grandchildren arrived for weekends. Their laughter was a balm. I taught them small practical things, how to check a manifest, why a signed promise matters. Anthony began to attend supplier meetings more often and slowly, his demeanor shifted from image first to substance first. Abigail learned, imperfectly, to listen and to value timely action over appearance. The auditors concluded that lapses were procedural rather than criminal. Recommendations included tighter procurement controls and a supplier fund. Some vendors received immediate settlements, others negotiated schedules. The public reaction ranged from praise for accountability to debates about performative contrition. For me, the core work was the structural repairs, contracts fixed, vendors compensated, and clear mechanisms to assure artisans they would be heard. Forgiveness unfolded in stages. I forgave as restitution was made, as daily behavior shifted, and as the public record matched private commitments. Forgiveness did not erase the hurt of that porch moment, but it transformed humiliation into a program of repair. In the end, the ledger mattered. Documented apologies, audited payments, and measurable restitution stitched dignity back into place. On quiet evenings I sat with Richards's watch on my dresser, and thought of the routes I had charted. Small ports, artisans, and hours spent negotiating fairness. My victory was not spectacle but process, insisting that harm be measured and repaired. That insistence saved me dignity, kept artisans whole, and taught my family that accountability can be louder than image. It was enough. This story, while fictionalized, reflects the deep sacrifices countless mothers make and the silent heartbreak they endure when their love is taken for granted. Names, places, and events have been shaped to protect privacy, but the message remains universal. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those we have given everything to. Now I want to ask you, if you were in my position, standing outside your child's home after being told you weren't worthy to be seen, would you quietly walk away, or would you fight to reclaim your dignity, even if it meant shaking the very foundation of family ties? Your thoughts may give courage to another parent silently living this reality. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my journey. May my story remind you that love is a gift, not a guarantee, and may it give strength to anyone who has ever felt discarded by the ones they sacrificed everything for. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never forget your worth.